In marketing, it's said that sex sells, and not too many manufacturers try to sell based on safety, and certainly not decade after decade. But that's exactly what Volvo has done, building a successful business of loyal customers on the concept of safety and building a reasonable car. The funny thing is this is not marketing speak to them. This is actually baked in at the very foundation of the company. And today, it's a far too brief history of Volvo.
87% of all Volvo buyers are college educated. The other 13% are just plain smart.
So welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I am John, and I have been a fan of Volvo for most of my life. I like boxy cars to begin with, so following Volvo from the 70s, 80s, 90s, as they became more rounded and more sexy, I have remained a fan. Whether it was my best friend whose father had a 244 back in the day to that V70 that's sitting in the driveway right now that my son drives, I'm a big fan of this manufacturer, and I found this to be extremely fascinating because I didn't know what their history was. If you think this starts as one brilliant industrialist working in a garage, you would be very wrong, as a matter of fact. So before we jump into it, two things. First, please recognize some of the words, especially at the beginning here, are Swedish. I will do my best, but please forgive me if I mispronounce them horribly. And the second thing is this is a company with almost 100 years of history. I cannot cover every single model and every single body style and every single engine they offer. This is going to be a brief history and an overview, and it's going to pick up speed once we reach about the 80s. So to understand the history of Volvo, you have to go back to Gothenburg, Sweden in 1907. A young man by the name of Sven Winquist was working as an engineer with the Gamla Stadens textile industry as an operation manager, and he was responsible for repairs and maintenance and looking to improve the design of ball bearings used at the time. In 1905, he patented the self-aligning ball bearing. In 1907, the multi-row self-regulating radial ball bearing. Now, these were both revolutionary upgrades of existing ball bearing designs, which dated back to 1794 and to 1840. So Sven and the owners of the textile industry founded Svenska Kullerfabriken, literally Swedish ball bearing factory, which is shortened to SKF, as a bearing manufacturer on February 16th, 1907. And within 3 years, they had 325 employees and a subsidiary in the UK. Today, SKF is the world's largest ball bearing manufacturer. Stay with me, we're getting to the cars. So in 1915, SKF registered the trademark Volvo to use on a new series of ball bearings that they were planning to introduce to America, probably for automobile uses. The word itself is derived from the Latin word volvere, which means literally to roll. Yes, Volvo means to roll. I love that. Anyway, Scania, the truck manufacturer over there, had been manufacturing cars, and in 1914 they ceased production of what it was at the time Sweden's only domestically built automobile, and after World War I chose to stay focused on trucks. And that's a story for a whole nother video one day. Regardless, in 1915, SKF was contacted by the Swedish Association of Engineers and Architects to look into manufacturing cars domestically, and they set up a project headed by Assar Gabrielsson, a sales manager with SKF, and an engineer by the name of Gustav Larsson. They'd never used that Volvo name on any bearings, instead staying with the SKF name, and so they brought it in and incorporated AB Volvo, where AB actually stands for Aktiebolaget, literally company. So after about 10 prototypes, they wanted to focus on a car that could withstand the rough and poor and muddy roads, the harsh Swedish weather, something they felt other brands were really lacking, and assembled their first prototype from parts they actually ordered out of supplier catalogs from Europe and the US. In 1927, they introduced their first car, the OV4. Now, I need to say that OV, actually, it's not an O, so I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. But They rolled this one out of the factory on April 14th, and comically the first car had the differential connected incorrectly, so the car actually had 3 reverse gears and only 1 forward gear, but it was a 10-minute fix, and soon they were off and running. It's interesting that in 1927, there's a quote that is, "Cars are driven by people. The guiding principle behind everything we make at Volvo, therefore, is and must remain safety." As I said, this is a foundational principle of the company, not just some marketing speak that they've used. With 60 workers building 5 cars a week, they only built 280 cars that first year, but by 1930 that had grown to 639. They almost immediately began to plan to manufacture a truck and introduced it, the Series 1, in 1928, from plans that actually predated the cars. The trucks with an inline 6-cylinder engine began to quickly attract attention, while the cars remained largely unknown outside of Sweden and sales were slow. As a side note, profits from the truck side of the business financed the company's operation for the next 20 years. The OV4 was sold between 1927 and 1929. It had a 4-cylinder engine and a frame made out of ash and beech covered with sheet metal. It was followed almost immediately by the PV4 in the summer of 27 that also had a wooden frame but was covered with an artificial leather instead of steel. It was also sold until 1929 and also had a 4-cylinder engine. The company's first 6-cylinder engine, a 3000 cc pumping out a whopping 55 horsepower, was ready in 1929, and Volvo introduced the PV651 that included 4-wheel mechanical brakes, while its successor, the PV652, got hydraulic brakes. These were sold until 1933. So through most of the 30s, heavy variations of the PV650 line were introduced up through the PV659, all of the variations with a 6-cylinder, increasing in displacement up to 3,670 cc and about 80-ish horsepower. In 1935, the company was listed on the Stockholm Stock Exchange, and shortly thereafter, SKF sold all of its shares, allowing Volvo AB Volvo to be an independent company. In 1935, Volvo actually began to style their cars and introduced the PV36, nicknamed the Carioca, after a popular South American dance. It featured an independent front suspension with wishbones and coil springs, an all-steel body, 3-speed on the floor, hydraulic brakes at all 4 wheels, and that same 3.6-liter engine with 80 horsepower. Up until 1938, about 501 were produced, with that one being a chassis used to make a convertible. They also introduced the PV51 through 56 models in 1936 as a smaller Volvo that sold well, about 6,900 units through 1945. In the 40s and after World War II, the PV60 was introduced, and it was the last of the large 6-cylinder cars with a side valve engine. While it was old-fashioned, it was popular and sold about 3,000 units through 1950. Volvo also bought a car called the Hanomag 1.3 liter, which was a unibody car designed and built by the German company. And in 1944, Volvo introduced and started taking orders for the PV444. It was priced at just 4,800 Swedish kronor, essentially the same as the original OV4, and it was an immediate hit, although buyers ended up having to wait until 1947 until everything worked itself out after the war. The PV444 was a 2-door, 4-seat unibody and had the first 4-cylinder in a Volvo in almost 20 years, a 1.4 liter producing about 40 horsepower. Later versions had a 1.6. It's worth noting that between 1949 and 1953, Volvo supplied chassis to independent coachwork firms as the PV445 to be the base for vans, estate cars, some drop head coupes, and small lorries. In 1953, the Duet was introduced and became the ancestor of the Volvo estate cars that they are so famous for today. In 1954, Volvo introduced an open-top 2-seater sports car with a fiberglass body called the P1900. Based on standard components from the PV444, it was built with a new tubular frame and the engine was massaged to about 70 horsepower. Originally, it was expected only to be for export, as Swedish weather does not normally make a favorable conditions for a two-seat open-top sports car. It ended up that out of the 67 or 68 that were built, almost every single one of those was sold in Sweden. But the car had incredible problems at the assembly line, and they ultimately just canceled it. In 1956, Volvo introduced the Amazon, also known as the 121 or the 122S, where the S indicated a sportier engine that was larger than the PV444 with 4 doors. It was a strong seller with relatively contemporary styling and a hint of a tail fin, and sold until 1967, moving about 234,000 units. The original engine was a 1.6 with 60 horsepower, but over its life received numerous upgrades, topping out at a 2-liter producing about 95 horsepower. As safety is a priority with Volvo, this car had a laminated windscreen, seatbelt attachments both front and rear, and the upper half of the dash was padded.
The more a person gets to know automobiles, the more likely he is to buy a Volvo. Volvos last an average of 11 years in Sweden. In Sweden, there are no speed limits on the highways. There are over 70,000 miles of unpaved roads. How long can you expect a Volvo to last here in the States? Nobody really knows yet.
The first Volvos came to the U.S. in 1955, being imported by a hardware wholesaler named Leo Hirsch to California. In 1956, Volvo began their official importing of cars to the United States. In 1958, the PV544 was phased in to replace the PV444 with subtle differences such as a ribbon speedometer, larger tail lights, and a 4-speed transmission. It also introduced the 3-point safety belt, and Volvo waived their patent rights so that other manufacturers could use it and benefit, and so could customers. In 1962, the 1.8-liter engine was installed, and sales continued until 1965. In 18 years, exactly 440,000 were built, and the models were so loved that when the company canceled it, they actually ran advertisements asking PV owners to not be angry with them. The 1960s were a big decade for Volvo. A 2-door version of the Amazon 121 was introduced called the P130, included getting a 1.8-liter in 1966 and the 2-liter. This car sold until 1970 with over 660,000 produced. With lessons learned from the P1900 of 1956 and 1959, Volvo presented a new sports car, the P1800. Again, with gorgeous fiberglass body, production began in 1961, but because they didn't have the capacity to build it, the first years were contracted to England with final assembly by Jensen. Based on the floor plan of the Amazon 121, but with a shorter wheelbase, it got an all-new 1.8-liter 4-cylinder, making 100 horsepower and later bumping up to 120. Sales continued through 1972, selling about 39,000 units. This was the car that was made famous by Irv Gordon for going over 3 million miles. In 1963, Volvo opened their first assembly plant outside of Sweden in Halifax, Canada. In 1966, history was about to be made again. Volvo introduced a brand new 4-door model named the 144. While boxy, it was an almost timeless design. Variations of it were sold until the 1990s, and the original model sold until 1974, hitting over 523,000 sales.
The Volvo 144 Grand Lux, one of the fastest Volvos on the road. A new 130 horsepower engine with electronic fuel injection. Marvelous acceleration, even at high speeds. And that's just why the disc brakes have been made extra powerful. The safety must be equal to the power.
Initially with a 1.8-liter producing about 75 or 90 horsepower, it was very spacious with a large trunk, boasted many new safety features, energy-absorbing crumple zones, front and rear disc brakes, and many others. The 2-door model was called the 142, selling nearly 413,000 units in 1967. The 145, as a 4-door wagon, was introduced, selling itself over 268,000 units through 74. Do some basic math, and that's well over 1 million units of variations of that 144. In 1968, they further developed the 144 into a more prestigious model called the 164 with a 3-liter 6-cylinder developed from the 2-liter 4-cylinder in the 140 series. Using better materials, including optional leather inside, it too sold well, selling about 146,000 units through 1975. In 1971, a new version of the P1800 was introduced called the 1800 ES. It was only produced until 73 with only 8,078 units and then ultimately dropped. Unfortunately, with more stringent safety regulations, primarily in the United States, it wasn't economically feasible for them to go develop a successor to it. In 1974, the 144 was being replaced with the now famous 240 and 260 series. Both developed from the 140 series, and similar but new styling included a 2-door, 4-door, and estate versions, revised chassis with McPherson strut suspension, and a new 4-cylinder with overhead cams. The previous engine was continuing to be offered in some basic models for a while. Well, many different engines and transmissions were offered over the life of this car until it was ultimately replaced in 1984. It's not a stretch to say the 244 became a classic in its own lifetime, lasting all the way till 1993 with 2 major facelifts. In all, more than 2.8 million cars of the 240 and 260 series were built. In 1972, Volvo purchased 1/3 of DAF Car BV in the Netherlands, and later they bought more, reorganizing as Volvo Car BV. The Volvo 66 was a development of a previous DAF 66 and gave Volvo an entry into the small car market with 2-door rear drive, a 1.1 liter 4-cylinder with 47 horsepower, and a CVT. 1972. In the 80s, the number of models exploded, and I can't cover them all here, and we'll focus on the more common ones here in America. I will note, however, that the 360 that ran between 83 and 89 looks for all the world to me like a Volkswagen Fox front end combined with an Alfa rear end. I think it's a pretty handsome little car, but I don't think that was ever exported to America. The 740 and the 760 were introduced in 82, taking the company up market and to include, of course, improved safety. The base version had a French V6, later replaced with a 4-cylinder turbo and a 6-cylinder diesel, and ultimately this car lasted until 1990. I've done a video previously about the 480, what I call the forgotten Volvo. This was intended to replace the 1800 as the sporty car here in the United States for Volvo. Between 85 and 89, it sold okay, about 76,000 units, but it had a very long development time, and by the time it was ready to be produced, the economics just didn't work, and it never actually came to America. I think that's a great sadness. I think it's a great looking car. In the 1990s, the 940 and the 960 range was introduced and ran through 98, replacing the 740 series, although it did end up staying in production. An entirely new model, the 850, was introduced in 91 and sold through 96 with an all-new 5-cylinder engine driving the front wheels. Upgraded safety included side impact protection, and in 94 it was the first car to offer side impact airbags. In its 5-year run, it sold over 390,000 units in sedan form and another 326,000 in an estate version. The 850 was developed into the S70 and its many body variants, running until 2000, and the sedan selling 243,000 units. The V70 selling another 319,000, and the foreshadowing XC another 53,000. In 1996 through 2002, Volvo offered a coupe, the C70, developed jointly between Volvo and Britain's Tom Walkinshaw Racing. It had a 2.4-liter 5-cylinder, and in this humble YouTuber's eyes, is one of the most beautiful cars ever produced. Yes, I said that. For all the new models, the new styling, and the new success, Volvo was hitting a rough patch. In 1990, Volvo was selling only about 90,000 cars a year in the US, but they were spending $40 million to do it. Acura, Lexus, and Infiniti were now on the scene, and Volvo was a relatively small player in an ever-increasing field that sold cars and wagons to responsible people. In 1999, AB Volvo sold off the car division to Ford. Now, back in the 70s, Volvo's CEO had seen that they were too small to survive in the future, and several attempts over the years had been made to merge with others, including with Saab. Norway offered to buy 40%, a deal with Renault was blocked in '83 by shareholders, and finally, Ford swooped in and bought a profitable Volvo for $6.45 billion and wrapped it up, made it part of Ford's premier auto group, along with Jaguar, Aston Martin, and Land Rover. AB Volvo bought many other companies over the decades, becoming more than just a truck and a car manufacturer, but also marine engines, aircraft, guided missiles, rocket engines, tanks, and heavy construction equipment. They continue to this day as one of the most successful heavy industrial companies in the entire world. But while part of Ford, they expanded their range of vehicles and their appeal. The styling became more rounded, more sexy, if I dare say so myself, and began to move upmarket. And by 2004, sales had increased to about 139,000 units a year in the US. It could be argued that with products like the C70, Volvos were not just being the safe car you need, but the safe car you want. Between Ford's purchase in 2009, Volvo introduced the XC90, the XC60, the C30, the S40, the XC70, and more. While many of these still exist successfully today, Ford badly mismanaged the acquisition. The second generation S40 and V50 were introduced in 2004 and were sold through 2012, and they were based on the Volvo P1 platform. It's worth talking about that platform in its own video, but what happened was Ford took 30 engineers, Mazda took 30 engineers, and Volvo took 30 engineers, and they put them together to combine over 2 years the compact car engineering for all three automakers. And this platform went on to underpin products like the Mazda 3, the Ford Focus, multiple Volvos, and the Mazda CX-7, just to name a few. While it didn't sell well in the US, topping out at barely 25,000 a year in 2006, globally the Volvo versions of this product sold about 602,000 units. The C30 was introduced in 2006 and sold through 2013, and a variant of the S4 range with an inline 4, inline 5 options, and was only a 2-door model with a very distinctive rear frameless glass hatch reminiscent of the early P1800 ES. It was never a strong seller in spite of being featured in the Twilight Saga, and sales hitting only about 4,300 units in 2008 and globally topping out at about 40,000 units that same year. Personally, I loved this car, and I would have bought one, except it was only a 2-door and I insisted on a 4-door. During this time, Ford decided that the brand built on safety meant, well, that they can ignore the safety message. By sheer force of will, they tried to position Volvo directly against BMW, Audi, and Mercedes. Unfortunately, Ford chose to ignore their own data that people who buy BMWs and Audis and Mercedes do not cross-shop to Volvo unless the Volvo is much, much cheaper. There was already a blueprint of how to sell a Swedish car at fire sale prices against the Germans, and that was Saab. And they were losing money hand over fist and ultimately went bankrupt. It is fair to say that Volvo lost its brand identity in the 2000s while Ford owned them, even when sales initially increased. By 2008, the banking crisis created its own crisis at Ford, who was desperate for cash. Years of starving Volvo for development money meant that its sales were beginning to sink, and by 2010, Volvo would sell only 54,000 cars here in America. Ultimately, Chinese company Geely paid $1.3 billion and $200 million note in 2010 for the company. It's worth noting in 2008, Geely was rated the 36th best car company in China. But unlike Ford, Geely agreed to let Volvo run Volvo again, and most importantly allowed the company to keep its cash to reinvest in future products. The company dumped the S40, the V40, the C30, the C70, the V70, and let the S80 gracefully fade away. They committed up to $11 billion for future development, and the newer generations of the XC90, S90, V90, XC60, and others have all been well received. Reported quality and reliability had dropped over the years, but recent data suggests it's back on track. They've built an engine plant and 2 assembly plants in China and another assembly plant here in South Carolina, while expanding research and development in Sweden and in California. The two companies have also created a synergistic relationship that made each better while working together to create a new company called Lynk & Co. L-Y-N-K & Co., which Ford is coincidentally very upset with because to them it sounds like Lincoln. After the purchase, by 2015, they'd sold over 500,000 cars worldwide for the first time in their 89-year history. In 2021, they reported $1.3 billion in profit on sales of nearly 700,000 units worldwide. They moved to hybridization, began adding electric vehicles to their core lineup, as well as the Polestar performance brand. And as with many brands, Volvo has announced that they're going to stop selling fossil fuel cars by 2030. In conclusion, I'm thrilled that Geely is handling Volvo the way they are and that they're allowing Volvo to be Volvo. They're allowing Volvo to build their identity, and I think they're building some of the best looking cars on the market right now with a quality that's improving as well. I don't think they're quite leading in electrification, but that doesn't really hurt my feelings too terribly much. But they're positioning themselves with their partner in Geely for the future. They're nearing on 100 years old right now, and I look forward to the next 100 years and what this company can bring to us, because you know what? They've had a lot of memories recently, and I can't wait to see what they do next. Hey y'all, thanks for watching. Please like this video, please subscribe to my channel, and please note I've got a Patreon. If you want to see your name up in lights below, please consider supporting independent creators such as myself who help bring you reviews, histories, and news pinions.